Yeah, and welcome to Neverwinter with Aragon. So here I want to rank all 9 classes within Neverwinter, splitting each of them into their Paragon Paths. For example, a Paladin will have a Tank path, and it will also have a Healer path. There'll be timestamps on the video play bar below where you can skip to any of the classes and their role. So the tanks will be in one section, the healers in another section, and DPS in another. And we're going to use this neat tool here to rank all of them from very good to very unreliable. However, keep in mind, and this is very important, we are ranking them based off this trial. It is the current latest endgame content within Neverwinter, Gzemnid's Reliquary Master. You need your character pretty much fully maxed out with then a lot of practice on your class to know what you're doing. Just be aware again, this is all from my opinion and perspective and from the people I hang out with and getting a bit of their opinion as well. Each of the classes can perform on varying levels and it can greatly depend on your skill and your knowledge of the content you're running. That can be a huge factor before going into specifics on classes. However, we're going to, in this ranking, mainly focus on the ease of play. How easy it is to fulfill your role, whether that's being a DPS, doing as much damage as possible, tanking as your tank, and healing as your healer. How easy it is to do that on that class, and thus how little time would you need to invest in order to be able to get to the top endgame content in Neverwinter and master it and be able to complete it on your class. Some classes, it's for sure a lot more challenging. So the first thing you will do when creating a new character is choose your race. I'll cover that all in another video. So clicking continue, you then choose your class. And we're going to start things out with the Barbarian. It can tank and it can DPS. Its DPS path is the Blade Master. And here's an example setup of what you will use in single target. That is when you're fighting a boss and want to be doing as much damage as possible against that boss. The Barbarian has its unique mechanic of Rage. You can see I just entered it there. Battle Rage. You obtain control immunity to most effects, an increase to your damage, and a reduction to the damage you take. It makes the Barbarian pretty survivable, and its powers has a lot of hard hitting ones, but they do have a longer cooldown, and so they're more burst damage orientated, but they're compensated with that with their at-will attacks, which when you use combined with your battle rage allow you to hit a lot faster, so you're racking off at-will attacks really speedily. You can deal a lot of damage over time. You also have your shift ability, which allows you to sprint and you can avoid enemies' attacks. However, you're a melee class. You have to be up close and personal with your enemy to be able to deal damage to them. And right now in this new trial, you will be suffering as a result. There's a lot of requirement to keep moving, to avoid mechanics, to make sure you're not taking unnecessary damage or even killing your teammates when you stay next to the boss. But the Barbarian's in a pretty solid state and I would rate them on pretty much average. Again, this is for the latest trial, latest endgame content. We'll cover the tank path later on in the video. So next up is the Bard. You can DPS or you can heal. The Bard's DPS path is the Song Blade, and this is a general setup you would use in single target. You have the unique mechanic where you can go into your performance mode and you can play some songs like this, and that gives you and your team some extra buffs. Otherwise, you have your general at-will attacks and then your encounter powers, and you will be able to use your encounter powers far more often than any other class due to your feat Performer. You have a bunch of abilities to increase the effectiveness of your team, but ultimately the Bard DPS, in order to be competitive in endgame, you're relying heavily on one feature in particular, Mystifying Strikes. and this relies on a 5% chance to activate and having as many players as possible to attack the target at the same time that it activates. So in a trial with 10 people, yes, it can work well. However, in the latest trial, you're splitting up into different groups and fighting different bosses. So you're ending up only having 5 players attacking your target, and thus you miss out on a lot of damage. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to put the Bard DPS in very unreliable. You need a specific scenario with a specific team in order to do well, and even then you're still relying on a chance. So next up we have the Cleric. It can DPS and heal. The DPS path is the Arbiter, and its unique mechanic is it uses divinity for the majority of its hard-hitting encounter powers. Your divinity is a pool of which you spend on those encounter powers, so you can dump those encounter powers all at once for some massive burst, and it pretty much makes it the best DPS class for burst damage. However, you'll have to learn a specific rotation and have to do a lot of practice in order to get it to work for you. You're going to have to know the content pretty much off the back of your hand, have a team which also knows what they're doing, and get your timing perfect. Because my oh my, if you die in the content, if you end up waiting for your burst or using your burst too early, you can just do no damage effectively. You can be so unreliable. Your main focus is around getting your perfect balance stacks, where you use one encounter and then the other encounter, and once you get 4 stacks of each, you can then go and get your perfect balance to restore all of your divinity back, as we'll do right here. And once that triggers, you can then repeat your rotation. And then you have your third encounter, Prophecy of Doom, which incentivizes you to deal as much damage as possible within 10 seconds, and after that 10 seconds you deal 30% of the damage you just dealt back to the enemy. Cleric DPS, not as unreliable as the Bard. I'm gonna just put it in unreliable, because again, if you die in the middle of stacking your perfect balance, your rotation is ruined and you have so much downtime before you can output significant damage again. So next up is the Fighter. Here you can be a DPS or a tank. For a damage dealer, you will be a Dreadnought, and this is an example setup you'll use in those boss fights. As a fighter, you have some of the hardest hitting powers in the game. It's just you have some pretty lengthy cooldowns, and then you're very much burst orientated. Your damage is a bit clunky, where you have to be up close to the target, and you also miss out on an immunity frame ability, an ability where you can completely ignore enemies' damage by just dodging. Here you can hold up your shield to absorb the damage. However, by doing so you're reducing your guard, and by reducing your guard you are reducing your damage through the stat bonuses, the massive stat bonuses that you gain as a fighter while your stamina is full. And on top of that, you have a unique feature, which is this, your Vengeance. Initially, you'll want to just use your Seethe to drain that stamina in order to stack up that Vengeance. The Vengeance gives you a boost to your damage and gives you some other bonuses as well to even higher damage. But once you're in combat, if you have the right feat, you won't have a problem maintaining your Vengeance. However, again, you suffer from being melee. You have to be right up close to your enemies in order to actually deal any significant damage. So you're taking a risk-reward factor. And on top of that, again, no immunity frame, no ability to quickly run out of the enemy's attacks. And ultimately, I find the fighter pretty clunky. And right now, I'm going to have to say, like the Barbarian, the fighter is on average. You have a lot of burst potential with some massive hard-hitting hits, but you definitely give up survivability to maintain damage. And on top of that, you're melee. So next up is the Ranger. Here you are just a DPS. You cannot heal or tank. Right now, the main viable Paragon Path is the Hunter. The other one is the Warden, and it can do pretty well in AoE fights where you're attacking lots of enemies, but the latest trial requires you to have majoritively single target damage, and so you'll be using a setup like this. The unique ability with the Ranger is stance switching to give yourself a lot of extra abilities. You can see each encounter power has 2 abilities depending on what stance you're in. Same with your at-will attacks. And so you will stance switch with your tab ability and PC, and you'll either be using your bow or your knives. However, to maximize your damage, you'll want to use both, like all your range powers, then all your melee powers, then back to your range powers and focusing on your ranged at will, and then using like your ranged powers again, and then the rest of your melee powers. And it's pretty much that simple, but it's something to get used to, switching between the stances. You do have on top of that some very good team support with Commanding Shot. It increases the incoming damage of the target and thus increasing everybody's damage who attacks that target. On top of that, you can use the melee ability to give everybody a shield equal to 15% of their maximum hit points. The Ranger right now does very well. Yes, you have some melee abilities you can use to maximize your damage, but you don't exactly have to use them. So in this new trial, in this latest endgame content, I'm going to have to put the Ranger in good. It tops out above the Barbarian and the Fighter across its raw damage and team support abilities. So next up is the infamous Rogue. Again, like the Ranger, you can only DPS. No tanking or healing paths. You will want to be going with the Assassin versus the Whisper Knife, as the Whisper Knife still needs a lot of attention from the devs and some reworks to be really viable outside of some specific scenarios. Now, I've played the Rogue quite a lot, and it's still my best class for like soloing and AoE content. But in single target, in the current endgame content, it suffers. Yes, some players can do very well on it, but in order to achieve that, you have to put a lot of work in and get a lot of practice with the mechanics of the content and completely master your timing. This is a setup you would use in boss fights, and the unique ability of the Rogue is going invisible. You can disappear. However, this doesn't matter at all against boss fights. The bosses don't care if you're invisible. They're going to attack you nonetheless. But in AoE fights, I'll tell ya, going in stealth is awesome. But back to boss fights. You will be relying mostly on burst damage, but you do have some damage over time effects which do help, especially if you need to play a mechanic and stop attacking. Your bleed from your Duelist Flurry is a big portion of your damage. And on top of that, we can use an encounter power like Path of Blades combined with some gear pieces to stack up some decent damage over time. But really, stacking your damage bonuses from stealth to your encounter power and feature allow you to deal some massive damage in your daily power and your mount power, specifically during an artifact call. So you need to master that timing. But again, the Rogue is melee. You're going to have to be always up close to your target to be able to deal any damage. So time on target in this new trial is a struggle. But ultimately, the Rogue is going to have to go on average with the Barbarian and Fighter. So next up is the Warlock. Here you'll be able to DPS and also heal. Your DPS Paragon will be the Hellbringer, and this will be a general setup you might use in boss fights. Your unique mechanic is your Soul Scorch. It'll allow you, when in combat, to gain these sparks, these soul sparks. And these soul sparks you will use combined with this feat to reduce the cooldowns of your encounter powers. And so you'll be using a lot of encounter powers, then using your tab ability, then doing some at-will attacks, and then back to your encounter powers. You will also want to learn animation cancelling with your Hellish Rebuke. This will allow you to reduce the cast time of the ability, allowing you to gain these soul sparks much more quickly. You do this by holding down your mouse button and then like holding A and D and then just pressing shift. This will animation cancel your at will. So again, Warlock is mainly about spamming your encounter powers, reducing the cooldown, and back to spamming them again with a little bit of at-willing in between. You're mainly focused on damage over time, combined with some buffs. On top of that, if there's any groups of enemies during the fight, you will have no trouble since a good few of your powers are already area of effect. You do have one feature which most classes are very envious of depending on the boss fight, which can give you permanently combat advantage against your target regardless of positioning. So it can give you a lot of flexibility and a significant advantage over other classes in some boss fights. Team support pretty limited. But nonetheless, Warlock Dps is in a pretty good spot and I'd put it on good. So last but not least for the damage dealers, we have the Wizard. Now the Wizard, since Module 24, is doing really well. You can run both Paragons, Thaumaturge or Arcanist, and compete versus the other damage dealers fairly comfortably. I would say the safest option is to just go with Thaumaturge, and once you master it and can have a Thaumaturge to buff you, switching to Arcanist can be the ultimate goal to fully max your damage, especially once you learn the fight and know when best to time your powers. But this would be a general support Thaumaturge build, where you will increase the effectiveness of your team by reducing the enemy's damage and increasing your allies' damage. Its unique ability is to simply have a 4th encounter power. So with 4 encounter powers, you can output quite a significant amount of burst damage, and your sustained damage is fairly decent as well. You have probably out of all the classes the best action point regeneration, so you're never going to really have too much trouble making sure you have your daily power for every 60 seconds for the artifact call. And you also have some very powerful area of effect daily powers if need be, to like break people out of the ice if you get Velindra and Storvald. And overall, the buffs it received in Module 24 put the Wizard probably in the best spot of all DPS right now. It's a very easy class to play and has some high damage potential, high output. You also have a second Paragon Path you can switch to for some fun and to even get higher potential. Again, if you have a Thaumaturge DPS who's going to buff you, since there are some interactions there which really make it that bit better. But yeah, not a lot to say about the Wizard. Recommend checking out my builds and guides for it. And I'm totally gotta put it in very good. It's very easy to pick up a Wizard for the first time and just do really well. You're fully ranged and not much more to pay attention to than pressing your buttons when they're off cooldown and holding down your at will. And then, of course, getting your timing right during an artifact call, but that's the same for every class. But that is all the damage dealers ranked, with the Wizard in top and the Bard in the bottom. Again, based off the latest trial, Gzemnid's Reliquary Master. That's the top tier endgame content as of Module 25. So we move on to the healers. First of all, we have the Bard, and you'll be playing as the Minstrel. The unique thing with the Bard healer is you'll be playing mainly songs to keep your allies healed rather than using encounter powers. You will use encounter powers to support your heals, these 3 usually. And so you'll be playing these songs, activating like a heal over time, then a security heal, which whenever anybody goes below 50% HP, they automatically get healed. And you can even activate that security heal again to immediately activate that heal. One area you do struggle in is healing a single target. You're not as good as the other healers, but on the positive side, you can even buff your teammates You can cause them to have increased damage reduction, and increased outgoing healing. On top of that, you can play a song which increases your party's damage, and along with that, their movement speed. You have a ton of things going for you as a bard healer. A lot of useful abilities, a lot of utility, more than any of the other healers, from buffs to automatic heals to heal over time to giving action points. And right now, most definitely, I gotta put the bard healer in very good. Don't compare them against DPS, just keep them in their separate sections. Compare DPS to DPS, compare healers to healers, and tanks to tanks when we get there. So next up is the Cleric Healer. Here you will be the devout cleric. You'll be using a setup something like this the majority of the time. You will have a divinity pool, which is right there on our left. And here we have over 1,000. You will use this pool to cast your healing powers. You can see they have a cost just there. So you'll be able to do a lot of heals at once if you wanted to, or space them out. Once you're in combat, your regeneration for that resource, that divinity, for your healing powers will slowly recover. So you need to moderate how much healing you use and when you use it. You can use exaltation to buff up your then healing word, which is your pretty massive heal over time, massive area as well, affects all your allies. But then you might want to use another heal power, Bastion of Health. This allows you to heal one target for a massive amount. However, the more targets you have in the area, the heal becomes smaller for everyone as it's divided amongst them. You have some of the most powerful daily powers for both mitigation with your hallowed ground, with your guardian of life for just massive heal plus heal over time for, again, everybody. And something you should learn in order to maximize your potential on the Cleric Healer is animation cancelling. Use the at-will scattering light, hold down the button, and then just spam your tab ability. Well, not so fast, but at a rate which you will still get the damage hits. And that'll allow you to get back your daily power much more quicker than if you just, let's say, held down the at-will. That way you'll be able to cast a lot more daily powers to support your team and keep them healed. Basically, the Cleric Healer is the best raw healer. If you need somebody who's just going to be healing your hit points all the time, a Cleric's best at it. You don't have outside of that much team support capabilities other than mitigation, reducing the damage people take. But you won't have all of the utility buffs like shields and movement speed and damage buffs that a bard might have. So I'm definitely going to put the cleric in good. Not very good, as it lacks the utility and the other tools that the bard can have. It lacks that potential, but it does its job very well. So it's in good. Then we have the Paladin Healer. Here you will be running as the Oath Keeper with a general setup like this. Your unique ability will be giving people shields. You won't heal them for as much as the other healers, but you will give them this added protection. Now it may not look like a whole lot, but I have a ton of hit points. This can equate to about 200,000 additional hit points. A damage dealer will be at max endgame about at 1 million. So that's 20% extra hit points. That can help you survive something that might otherwise kill you in one hit. And that's why the Paladin Healer is so valuable. Of course, you're also healing with those powers. You're not just shielding. And you also have the ability to protect a tank, like really a lot. You can see once you go and put these wings, this aura of divinity on a target, you can go and use your hand of divinity, which is this power, 1000 heal magnitude, but it can provide a massive shield. On a target which has some extra incoming healing, you can easily fill their entire hit points with shield, basically doubling their hit points. And that is what makes the Paladin Healer so special. The ability to provide those shields, those layers of protection. The problem is its lack of raw healing, its lack of actual heals. If your team is taking a ton of heavy damage, you're going to struggle to keep them healed back up. But in the new trial, not a big deal, because you're going to be running at least 2 healers most of the time, and thus that other healer can back you up where you miss those raw heals. But again, you have this divinity pool, and each of your heals have a cost, and you'll be able to spend it wisely. You'll be able to spam your heals for a period, and then you might have to wait to regenerate them back. And you mainly use Sacred Weapon and Circle of Divinity to regenerate back your divinity nice and quickly, and then it's just spamming your encounter powers. I would say the Paladin Healer probably a little bit more difficult to play, because you want to make sure your shields are active when they're really needed. For example, just before the Withering Ray ends. That is within the new trial. So right now, I can't put the Paladin Healer really high up there. I'm going to put him on average. He could do with definitely a few buffs to make him a little bit more powerful, but because of what he does, the unique effect of always being able to maintain adding those shields means it's very valuable. So next, it's the Warlock Healer. Here you will be running as the Soul Weaver. Again, like all other healers, you have a pool just here, but this is it's called Soul Weave, and you'll use that Soul Weave to cast your heal powers. They each have a cost right there, and so you'll only be able to use so many before you're out. Now, the limitation on the Warlock Healer is that your heals are always maintained in an area. For example, right here, I have to stand within the area in order to actually get healed. Now, in some content, that's fine, that's alright, people can group up and stand in your heals. But in other content, well, not so fine. And well, this new trial is very punishing for people who stay together, so not really a possible thing. So right now, sadly, the Warlock Healer is going to have to go in unreliable. It's just can't perform its job properly in that latest endgame content. So now we're going to move on to our tanks. There are 3 of them. First of all, we have the Barbarian, and here you will run as the Sentinel. You might have a setup something like this. Now, your job as the tank is, of course, to get hit. You want to be taking all the hits and not your damage dealers, not your healers. You're protecting them by taking the damage instead of them. Now, you do that by generating threat. I've explained in other videos how threat works, so on and so forth. I'll make dedicated videos for the other tanks. I haven't done full testing on the Sentinel yet. But you want to be using powers that have increased threat to generate that threat, and powers to put you on top of the threat list to make sure that you can either switch tank if you're in a trial and you need to, or you need to jump back to the top if you lost the threat. Now, the problem with the Barbarian Tank is this particular power, Primal Fury. You have to receive damage in order for it to actually deal much damage at all. Right now, if I'm to use my Primal Fury, it's only hitting for like 9,700. That's nothing. We need that to hit for like 60,000, 70,000, 100,000 in order for it to deal much damage, in order for it to have much threat. So the problem with the Barbarian Sentinel now is that it does not have much threat. Survivability, no problems. You can go into your unstoppable rage right here, and whenever you're within it, you'll automatically block attacks, and you will block attacks up to the amount of your stamina. And this is your guard. You can also use it just anytime here. When I'm getting attacked, I can go use my shift and I'll block those incoming attacks on my guard. My guard is equal to 40% of my maximum hit points. So it's just a layer of protection which you can generate back yourself, basically healing that extra layer of hit points. While within your unstoppable, that layer of hit points, that guard, goes up to 60% of your maximum hit points, and you gain some additional effects like control immunity, and if you're using this feature you can receive extra stamina restoration when that ends, so on and so forth. So it's a balance between using powers which have increased threat and powers which might give you some hit points and give you some stamina back, but ultimately the Barbarian Tank suffers because of it lacking threat generation. The most important time to generate threat is it right from the beginning, and you can see you start with 0 rage. So you cannot generate much threat until after a little bit into the fight, and then only once you've been hit quite a lot. So you either need a group that's going to be patient with you, or again, you are just struggling at your role. Other tanks can just do it far better. Right now, I'm gonna have to put the Barbarian Tank in unreliable. Next up, we have the Fighter Tank. Here you'll be running as the Vanguard. Now you have a lot of abilities. Place you on top of the threat list, having increased threat, having your retaliate ability with your dig in, and basically, unlike the Barbarian, you can dig in, effectively activating your tab ability whenever you want. There's no limitation like needing to have rage and so on. So you're able to generate that threat very reliably right from the get-go. You take a hit, you retaliate, use your daily power, so on and so forth. You can generate a ton of threat, and on top of that, you can have a ton of survivability by being able to dig in whenever you want, and whenever you do dig in, you also increase your statistics. On top of that, you have some really good team support daily powers, like your phalanx. Right here, you activate this, everybody within the area takes 20% less damage. On top of that, enforced threat, you reduce the awareness of your target. By doing so, you're increasing the damage all your allies do to the target. And otherwise, you have Knight's Valor. It's an easy tool to draw all the threat from the target. You basically link with an ally, intercept all the damage they would take, and you suck all the threat generated from that cover target to you. So you're just gaining all the threat that that person could do. Coordinated team, you just have one damage dealer stand next to you, and you draw all the threat as they do damage, and you'll have no problem staying on top of the threat list. So right now, the Fighter Tank is one of the best. You have a whole bunch of tools along with team support, massive threat, massive survivability, really reliable, and so most definitely it goes in very good, specifically for this new trial. And so finally, we have the Paladin Tank. Here you'll be running as the Justicar. Now, I personally play it a lot. You can see all my content, running the latest trial, my build, so on and so forth, all on the Paladin Tank. This is my general setup for the new trial. You have some team support here and there, but otherwise you can generate a lot of threat when you need. So you don't have much trouble there, which is great. Definitely a bit trickier, a bit harder and challenging than the fighter, but it's manageable. It's maintainable. You can do it within the new trial without too much trouble. You just don't get the free ticket like Knight's Valor. And on top of that, sad part is you are using that divinity for threat instead of being able to use it for survivability through Divine Champion. Like our tab ability, Divine Champion, you activate it like so, but you drain your divinity while using it. And you can block like this, protect allies behind you, which is nice, but again, you're still draining this divinity. Once the divinity's gone, it deactivates and you have a 5-second cooldown. So if you want to use that divinity for threat, then you have nothing left for your own protection and for protecting your teammates. But usually it's okay, because at the beginning of the fight you'll use the divinity for threat, and when the fight goes on it gets easy to maintain threat through tank switching, through using vow to place yourself on top of the threat list, and so you'll be able to use that divinity for some survivability and for some protection. But ultimately, the Paladin Tank is in an okay spot. I would like to see a few adjustments here and there, but it can do its job well, especially in this new trial. It doesn't have much trouble there. So, the Paladin Tank, I will put him in good. And that is my entire tier list. We have the damage dealers, we have the healers, and we have the tanks. Keep in mind, compare them separately based on what rank they are. You're not going to compare a wizard versus a fighter tank. They're both going to perform their roles completely separately. One's a damage dealer, one's a tank. But that is where I would rank each of the classes within module 25. And again, this is directed at the latest trial, Gzemnid's Reliquary. In module 26, there'll be something else. Same in the following modules. I try to make a new one of these videos every module to keep you guys up to date. But ultimately, if you are choosing a class to play, mainly just go for one you enjoy. Go for one that you like the look of, you like the sound of, and you'll probably have some fun. If you really turn out not to like it, well, you made the character and you can use it to farm events and so on, and you can make another character. But hopefully this has been somewhat insightful, bit of an overview of each class, and ultimately my rankings on the classes for this current module. Outside of endgame content, it doesn't matter. As a whole, each class can perform its role to a sufficient level to complete all content. It's just in master trials and master dungeons where you really see the difference, and the skill level required per class does vary, that's for sure. For example, right now, Gzemnid's Reliquary running as a melee damage dealer, you're going to have a much tougher time at it than, let's say, a ranged damage dealer. So with that, a massive thank you again to all these channel members for their added support. You can support me for as little as €1 a month by clicking the join button down below. So we'll see you guys around. Goodbye for now.